Hi, and welcome to the Genetic Counseling Wellness Masterclass, Episode 1. My name is Sierra Endicott, and I'm the Supportive Care Services Coordinator here at Ironwood Cancer and Research Centers. Our Supportive Care Services Department has created this series to help promote healthy lifestyle habits and help you to get actively involved in your health. Cindy Kass, our Certified Counselor with Ironwood Cancer and Research Centers, is here to present on My Family Has Cancer, My Family Member Has Cancer. Do I need genetic counseling? Let's all welcome Mandy.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Sierra, and thank you to all of you for taking the time out of your day to join me tonight for this presentation. As Sierra mentioned, my name is Mandy Kass. I'm a certified genetic counselor, and I've been with Ironwood now for a little over 4 years. And for those of you that aren't familiar, my role within Ironwood is to work with patients to better determine if their cancer or their family history of cancer could have some kind of underlying hereditary cause. So I'm really excited to have the opportunity tonight to talk with all of you about cancer genetics. That's certainly a topic that I'm very passionate about, so hopefully you all will get some valuable information. So we'll kind of jump right in. Of course, tonight's topic is family histories of cancer and when we want to consider genetic testing. We've got a few goals for the evening. Of course, we're going to talk about genetic testing and how genetic test results are used for individuals and their family. But before we get into that, I'd like to also spend some time kind of going through kind of a crash course on genetics. I think for a lot of us, maybe the only exposure that we get to genetics in our life is maybe back in high school biology. And for some of you listening, that might have been just several years ago. For others, that was maybe several decades ago. So we're going to kind of bring everyone up to speed and just give you a very basic understanding of genetics. Kind of jump right into that genetics crash course. So as some of you might already be aware, our bodies are made up of trillions of different cells. And within each of our cells is our genetic material, or our DNA. Now, if we were to zoom in on that DNA, we would find that it's made up of 23 pairs of chromosomes. Now, if we zoomed in a little bit further on those chromosomes, we would find that the chromosomes are made up of lots and lots of different genes. And all of these genes come in pairs. Okay, and that's because we get one pair from our biological mother and the other pair from our biological father. And basically, what our genes do is they kind of act like a blueprint for our body. So some of them tell us what color to make our hair, our eyes. Some of them help us determine how to develop the heart. And some of them actually work in our body to help protect us from certain types of cancer. So we sometimes refer to those as tumor suppressor genes. And really what those genes are doing is they're helping repair damage within our DNA. So you can imagine that if some of these cancer protection genes are not working properly, we might not be getting that damage repair. And then we might see a lot of genetic damage start to accumulate, and that's when we might see some problems arise. So what sometimes people are surprised to hear is that all cancer is actually genetic at its core, but not all cancer is actually hereditary. And I think as a society, we oftentimes think of those two words, genetics and hereditary, as being one and the same. But in this case, there's actually some key differences. So next, I'm going to kind of go over the ways that cancer can be genetic and not hereditary, and then the ways that, of course, cancer can be hereditary as well. So the first way where cancer can be genetic is through acquired genetic mutations. And in genetics, we refer to this as somatic genetic mutations. And these are essentially mutations that occur within the tumor tissue or the cancer itself. So these are not mutations that are taking place within every cell of our body. These are not mutations that we inherited or were born with. These are mutations that we acquire over time. Now, sometimes these mutations can occur randomly, and sometimes we know that different exposures or lifestyle factors might play a role in in those mutations developing. So, things like radiation exposure, different chemical or toxic exposures, lifestyle, as I mentioned. And when we talk about lifestyle, we're talking about things like a smoking history or alcohol use, but also things like our diet and also our activity level. Are you someone that leads a pretty active lifestyle, or are you someone that maybe leads a somewhat more sedentary lifestyle? So all of these things kind of play into whether or not we might see some of these mutations occur and start seeing this genetic damage accumulate. Now, this is what causes most cancers. So I'd say about 90% of cancers are not inherited and are considered more of these sporadic cancers. Sometimes we even refer to them as more environmental cancers. Now, the other way that we know that cancer is genetic is through inherited genetic mutations. And in genetics, we refer to this as germline genetic mutations. So this happens when someone actually inherits a genetic mutation. So they're born with this. Basically, it's been there from the moment they were conceived, and it's present in every single cell within their body. And inherited forms of cancer generally account for about 10% of cancers. So definitely a smaller portion than that sporadic form of cancer that we talked about earlier, but it still makes up a pretty decent chunk of cancers. Now, a good way to think about the differences between the sporadic cancers and the inherited cancers is with an example. So if you imagine that there's two very similar individuals, they both go to spend the day at the beach, but one of them is born with an SPF 8 in their skin, and the other individual is born with an SPF 50 in their skin. Who would you imagine is going to be more likely to leave the beach that day with a sunburn? Probably that person that was born with the SPF 8, because essentially they were born with a little bit less protection from the sun. So again, that wouldn't guarantee that that person's going to have a sunburn. There could be other factors that are protecting that person, but we know that if someone's born with less protection, there's just a higher likelihood that we could see these types of things happening. So here's just kind of a visual representation of some of the different factors that might go into someone's personal cancer risk. So of course, we just kind of talked about the genetics. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about family history as well. But then you see on here the environmental components, lifestyle components. You'll see aging on there as well. One of the #1 risk factors for cancer is actually just normal aging. And that's because the longer that we live, the longer that we've had to have different exposures and lifestyle factors that might be causing genetic damage. So that's why we usually see most cancers being diagnosed when someone's in their maybe 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond, because that person has just had more time to accumulate that genetic damage. And then we see, random chance on there as well. Sometimes people can live the most healthy lifestyle. They don't have any known exposure histories. Their genetics, everything comes back normal if they do testing. Maybe there's no family history, and we still might see cancer develop. So sometimes it is somewhat of a mystery still, unfortunately. But these are really the main things that we think about when we're thinking about someone's cancer risks. So at this point, now that we've kind of looked at the differences between sporadic cancers and hereditary cancers, you might be wondering how we differentiate between those two groups. And there are some specific red flags that we look for that help us determine if someone might have a higher likelihood to have one of these hereditary predispositions to cancer. So we'll go through a few of them. One of the main things I'm looking for is the age that someone was when they were diagnosed with their cancer. And that's, kind of like we discussed previously, that's because if someone was born with a predisposition to cancer, we would expect that there might be a higher likelihood that they develop cancer at an earlier age than we would expect. So, if I see someone with breast cancer under the age of 45, even just under the age of 50, that looks unusual to me. Or colon cancer under the age of 50, that's another kind of red flag. I'm also looking for rare cancer types. So you'll see listed here ovarian cancer, pancreatic cancer, male breast cancer. There's certainly others that we look for, but these are really the main ones that really jump out to me in a family history. And that's because, as I mentioned, they are more rare cancer types just in the general population. And we do know that these specific cancer types have a higher likelihood to be linked to some kind of hereditary genetic risk factor. I'm also looking for multiple cancer types in a single person. So in this case, I'm not necessarily referring to a metastatic cancer or a cancer that's spread from one organ system to another. In this case, I'm really referring to someone that has had multiple primary or separate cancer types. So maybe someone that's had both colon and uterine cancer in their life, or both breast and ovarian cancer. Those types of things look a little bit more unusual. They might be linked to something hereditary. Of course, family history is a very important tool that we use as genetic counselors. You know, some of you might know that when we meet with patients, we usually sit down for, you know, maybe an hour at a time to really go through someone's family history in detail. So we're looking at, you know, parents' generation, grandparents' generation. If we can go further back, we do, but most people can't. But really what we're looking for in these families is how many people have had cancer, how many people haven't had cancer, and what are the types of cancers that we're seeing in this family. So kind of as I mentioned before, if I'm seeing certain combinations like breast and ovarian cancer or colon and uterine cancer, those are some tip-offs for me that maybe there's something genetic going on because there's specific genes out there that we know of that are supposed to protect us from those specific cancer types. I'm also looking at things like pancreatic cancer and melanoma. That looks unusual to me. Or breast cancer and sarcoma, which is a rare tumor type, or certain brain cancers. That also looks suspicious to me. So again, those are just several examples. There's certainly lots of other combinations of cancer types that we're looking for, but those are some of the big ones that we do look for. So at this point, now that we've kind of gone through those red flags, I'd imagine that some of you listening might be kind of thinking about genetic testing for yourself. You know, maybe you're realizing that some of those red flags sound consistent with your own family history. So you might be wondering about the logistics of genetic testing, you know, what does it entail, what does it cost, those types of things. But you might also be wondering what kind of information genetic testing is going to be able to provide for you and your family. So we'll kind of go through those details next. Start with the logistics of genetic testing. So genetic testing, it's not an invasive test. It's done with a saliva or a blood-based sample. Saliva and blood testing, it's identical in terms of accuracy. It's just two different methods to extract the DNA. Usually the genetic testing that we order nowadays, it encompasses a large group of genes. So we refer to this as panel testing. Basically what that does is it casts a wide net. So instead of just looking at, you know, one or two genes at a time like we did in the past, we like to really cast that wide net. And that way, if there is something hereditary happening in that individual that's putting them at a higher risk for cancer, we can hopefully have a higher likelihood of finding it with those larger panel tests. Generally, genetic testing is actually best when it's done in an affected family member. So what I mean by that is doing testing in someone that's had a personal history of cancer. So for some of you listening, maybe you're thinking to yourself, you yourself have never had cancer, but maybe you're concerned because your mom had breast cancer in her 40s. Really the best person to test in that scenario would be your mom because she has that personal history. And that way, if we were to find something hereditary in her that's causing that breast cancer to happen, then we know exactly what we need to be looking for in other family members. Now I should mention, we don't have to have an affected family member to be able to do genetic testing. Of course, sometimes we find families where everyone that's had cancer has passed away, or maybe people that have had cancer in the family are not interested in testing, or they're not available for the testing. So we can certainly do testing in people that haven't had that personal history. We just want to make sure that we fully understand the limitations with interpreting that person's test results. And in terms of insurance coverage, testing may or may not be covered by someone's insurance, usually based on specific insurance criteria, which is usually based on someone's personal and/or family history of cancer. But the good news is, thankfully, there are some self-pay options available for this type of testing at this point. So really anyone that's interested for the test in this type of testing, they can have the testing done. Really the main self-pay options that are available are around $250. So that kind of leads us to the next big question, which is, what is this testing going to be able to tell you? You know, how can you use this information? The main thing that this testing is going to be able to tell someone is if there is some kind of identifiable inherited risk for cancer in them. Now, if we find that in someone, this is the opportunity to create a more personalized screening plan for that person, with the goal being to try to keep them safe from cancer. Maybe we can try to prevent a cancer from occurring, or we can try to detect something at the earliest, most treatable stage if we think someone has that higher risk. For someone that has a current diagnosis of cancer, it could even have some implications for their treatment plan. Of course, if we do find that there is some kind of genetic mutation within the family that's putting people at risk for cancer, then we can start testing other family members to really identify who has those risks and who does not have those risks, so we know who needs to follow those more personalized screening plans. So in terms of kind of big picture items here, or the takeaway from this talk, the main things are: be aware of your own family medical history when possible, and make sure that your doctors are aware of any changes to that history. Now, one thing I'll point out is that when it comes to a family history of cancer, we don't want to just think about our immediate relatives. We also want to think about those extended relatives as well. So, you know, I'm talking about aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents. If you know anything further back in your family history, that's definitely important to share if you can. So again, we're not just thinking about parents, siblings, and children. We want to really factor in the full family history. We also want people to consider their own personal cancer risks. So, you know, we showed that diagram there with all of the different bubbles, all of the different things that might go into someone's risks. So it's important just to take a moment and kind of think about your own risks. You know, do you have a family history of cancer? Is genetic testing something that your family might want to be considering? But also look at your lifestyle. You know, are you someone with a current smoking history? You know, maybe working to try to quit would be beneficial. Are you someone that, you know, maybe doesn't have the healthiest diet? Maybe working on that would be beneficial. Or trying to increase your activity level. But also being aware of the environment that you live in. You know, are you maybe not a smoker yourself, but maybe you live in a home with people that do smoke? Maybe trying to limit your exposures as much as you reasonably can. Of course, we recommend that everyone keeps up with their age-appropriate cancer screenings. So even if you've taken a moment to consider your own personal risk factors and you're leading a healthy lifestyle, you're active, you've got a great diet, you live in an environment that feels very healthy, and you have no family history of cancer, we would still recommend that you keep up with all of the age-appropriate screening, because we know that early detection is key when it comes to successful cancer treatments. And then, of course, you know, after listening to this talk, if you're thinking that genetic testing might be something that would be beneficial for you or your family members, I would definitely encourage you to, you know, either talk to your doctors, but you're also welcome to reach out to myself, reach out to my colleague Rachel. We'd be happy to answer any questions that you have about the testing options that are available, and if that's something that you should really be considering. With that, I'll kind of open it up for any questions, or if there's anything that you'd like me to clarify further, please just let me know.
Great. Thank you so much, Mandy, for that talk. It was very valuable information. We do have two questions here. The first one is, can insurance drop you if you are found to have a predisposition to have cancer based on genetic testing?
good question. There is actually a federal law in place called GINA. This stands for the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. And this law was actually passed back in 2008 under the Bush administration. So it's been in place for quite a while now. What this law does is it prevents your health insurance from being able to discriminate against you based on a positive genetic test result. So essentially, your health insurance cannot look at those test results and say that you have a pre-existing condition. Really, the only way that they can use that positive genetic test result is to justify paying for the increased screenings or the preventative procedures. They really cannot use it in any type of discriminatory way. Now, I will say there's a few areas where that law does not cover people, and that's in the areas of life insurance, long-term care, and disability insurance. So technically, those insurances can ask you if you've had genetic testing done, and they can use that information to make determinations about your coverage. To be honest, in my 4 years of working with Ironwood, I have not ever had a patient tell me that they've had issues getting those insurances covered with a positive genetic test result. However, I always like to make sure that patients are aware that there is technically no law in place that would stop those insurances from asking you about genetic testing. But your health insurance, you're covered. That's usually the big question that patients have.
Great, thank you for that clarification. That's very helpful information. Next is, what do you think about 23andMe and Ancestry testing?
Sure. So in terms of what we generally refer to in genetics as direct-to-consumer genetic testing. So this is testing that you can jump online and order yourself without a genetic counselor or a doctor or any kind of provider being involved. The main companies are usually 23andMe and Ancestry.com, several others. I think these are fun opportunities for people to maybe learn a little bit more about their ancestry. 23andMe can include some health-related information. Majority of the information that you get about your health from 23andMe is not really all that actionable. But for those of you that are really curious about these ancestry tests and the direct-to-consumer type of testing, I would definitely encourage you to stay tuned for our next topic in our master class series, because my colleague Rachel is actually going to give an entire presentation on that topic. So I won't dive too deep into that question, because I could certainly sit here all evening and talk about that, but it's more just for fun, in my opinion. It's not really going to give you a lot of useful, actionable information. If you're looking for genetic information that's going to have some kind of impact on your healthcare, I certainly would encourage you to talk to your doctors or a genetic counselor about that kind of testing.
Great. And we actually have a question closely related to that. What brand of testing kit do you recommend? And I think that this viewer should stay tuned for our next masterclass on September 30th. What do you say, Mandy?
I think they definitely should. I'm assuming they're referring to the direct-to-consumer type of genetic.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I would definitely stay tuned. I'm sure Rachel will be able to go into all the different options that are available.
Okay, great. Thank you to all our viewers. Please join us at our next talk with Rachel Matterhouse. She is our East Valley Certified Genetic Counselor, and she will be presenting on what kinds of genetic tests are there, a genetic counselor's guide to consumer-initiated genetic testing. She will be going over information such as what kind of information can consumer-initiated genetic testing, such as Ancestry.com and 23andMe, provide for you. So thank you again, Mandy, for some great information. We really appreciate it. And you all have a great night. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.